we're going to have a panel on the future of reef restoration. And so we want you guys to ask questions, ask hard questions of these guys. We have some of the leading experts that represent managers, that represent scientists, and represent practitioners to answer your questions about where they see restoration going, where they see some of those risks. So Dr. Steve Palumbi, who you just had, is going to join us on the panel first. Dr. Lena Bay with the Australian Institute of Marine Science, who you heard from yesterday. Sarah Fangman with the Florida Keys National Marine Sanctuary, who you just heard from. Dr. Kristen Marhaver with CARMABI, who you heard from yesterday as well. Jennifer Moore with NOAA, another manager's perspective. And Dr. Phanor Montoya Maya with Corals de Paz. And Heidi Stiller will be our moderator. Did I forget somebody? I was like, there's an extra chair. Did I forget somebody on my list? All right. And Heidi Stiller will be our moderator. So I'm going to get off. You guys have heard my perspective on a lot of stuff here and let these guys talk about it. But I'm going to start with the first question for them to kind of demonstrate the hard questions that we want you guys to ask. And feel free to push them on follow-ups on my question here as well. And I will caveat this with saying that some of our people here are managers, and they may not feel super comfortable answering this question that I'm about to ask them. And so I will give them a pass on this particular question and let the scientists dig into it. So that's, as a scientist, what is your perspective on restoring for ecosystem services, even if that means using different species or species with a very different genetic mix than what was originally in that particular ecosystem? And we've got microphones for you guys to share.
Who wants to start?
There you go. Yeah, go ahead and start.
Yep, you're on.
No.
Well, I think that is a really challenging question, right? I think that many of the interventions, particularly the genetic interventions, exist across a spectrum, and there's risk the whole way. We may introduce genes within the species range through assisted gene flow, or we might end up getting genes from outside the ocean basin. So on the Great Barrier Reef, for example, it could be possible to import genes from the Red Sea. We have overlap in the species. I think it's important that we examine all of these interventions, but I'm not sure that we would necessarily be very upfront about this. As Ken Anthony said in his talk, in Australia we have a history of introducing species. The cane toad is an awful example of what can go wrong, and it's very deeply seated in the Australian psyche. When I talk to family and friends about what I do, they say, isn't that the next cane toad? And so we need to examine the risks and the benefits of all interventions, but introducing species is certainly something I would be leaving in the toolbox for as long as I can, wrapped in plastic, throw away the instructions.
I would agree. I would agree entirely, but one of the reasons why we have options right now is because, or we have possibilities and opportunities because options haven't been closed off, and things like introducing species tend to close off options. We can close off this option right now. There. And then, so introducing new species into areas closes off options in the future because we don't know exactly what the future is going to bring, right? We know the problems we have now, but what problems are going to be there in 20 or 30 or 50 years. So same is true of adding genes, but we know at least in the Pacific and at least through the Caribbean that most genes have gotten around by now. There have been millions of years of corals evolving in their current range. And so there's less of a problem, I think, in having different genes in an area if they're part of the regular species complex. So that would be the range of not so worried about genes within species, very worried about new species that come from different regions.
My take on that is, and I think Buki Rinkevich has it really clear for a long time, is the reefs of tomorrow. I mean, we have in our minds what we know now of reefs and what we know from the past, but we definitely don't know what the future is going to bring. There are places where corals are dying, but there are places where corals are increasing in cover. I was lucky to do my PhD in South Africa, high latitude reefs, for instance. You know, there it's going to get warmer for sure, but that's going to buy time for corals too. You know, so there are new areas for reef development that we're not going to see in our lifetime. You know, reefs take years, and that's what we're working on. That's why we're so concerned, because they take years to develop. So definitely the reef of tomorrow are going to be different to what we see today. And what I try to say to my team to keep us going is that we are rehabilitating live coral cover to restore coral reef ecosystem services. And that may involve and realizing that the components and the elements of those reefs may be different to what they are right now. And we need to live with that.
We're all trying to pass the buck. I turned my microphone off because I thought maybe that was the echo we're getting. We'll be fine with two. We got a sneak preview of this question yesterday, and my answer was, oh, Mark and I play the game all the time. If you could introduce a Pacific species, which one would you introduce? You guys have so many species. And my answer is always Fungia. It doesn't really build reefs, but it's very cute. And his answer is always giant clams. It's not even a coral. But it's obviously something we don't think about doing right away, but we do think like, well, there's ecological functions, and maybe there's animals that could do them for us over in our little lagoon of the Caribbean. And so I like Lena's perspective. We'll keep that idea in the toolbox before we throw it completely away. I think there's also a potential for us to invent, say, sterile corals that would grow and encrust and cover seawalls but not reproduce. You can do that with a watermelon. You take a 2N watermelon and a 4N watermelon, and you hybridize them, and you get a seedless 3N watermelon that can't sort its chromosomes into two piles and can't make gametes. So you don't have any seeds, so it's a sterile watermelon. So I obviously don't think this is numbers 1 through 500 on our list of options, but maybe there's a seedless watermelon coral someday that could encrust the gnarliest, turfiest seawalls and give us that shoreline protection in the most disgusting bays. Don't make that your PhD project, though. It's a terrible idea.
All right, thank you all.
Now give us the easy questions.
So as you can see, we've got a couple microphones in the aisle, just as we did before for questions. So if you have a question for our panel, please step up to one of those microphones. I think we have a young woman coming right this second. And please share with us just your name and affiliation before you ask your question.
Hello. Hello. I don't know, is this on? Okay. My name is Zaneri. I'm a grad student at University of Alberta in Canada. Forgot my name tag, sorry. So love hearing these messages, being big and bold, and inaction is not an option. And bringing all these diverse perspectives together here really shows that. However, I've noticed a little bit of a disconnect between being big and bold in the scientific community versus outside. So as an early career scientist, how can we be big and bold outside of the scientific community to make policy makers and decision makers accountable?
Vote.
any advice on that or ideas?
You asked the wrong tiny close-knit community of nerds in their workshops. I can offer an anecdote about that. When I was at Scripps with Jeremy Jackson and Nancy Knowlton, it was a bunch of sort of doe-eyed conservation biology students in California, and Jeremy would scream at us to stop talking like hippies with his hands. Stop talking like hippies! And we were like, but we are hippies. We're in California doing marine conservation. And his point was learn environmental economics and learn policy and learn how to speak the language of money, because that's what matters in politics and in government. And so we can be as sort of idealistic as we want inside our community, but when we turn to face decision makers, we should be able to talk in the languages and the currencies that matter to them. So get that practice if you can.
To Phanor? Go ahead, Steve, and then we'll go to...
I would echo that, but also say that it's not just the language of economics, but the language of personal passion and what you care about. You know, you're from Alberta. Why should you care about coral reefs? So being able to articulate that to your family and your representatives and the people around you is really important, because it's okay for that to matter to you, and it's okay for what the important thing to matter is boreal forests or grasslands or. Every ecosystem on Earth is facing exactly the same problem as coral reefs. Every ecosystem is going to have to be helped, restored, and made better during this crisis of climate change. This is an example, if nothing else, of how complex ecosystems can be worked on by enthusiastic and bold and bright people to make the world a better place. So those kind of messages, if they resonate with you, talk to people about it. Don't shy away from it. Just say, this is what matters to me and this is why. And you might find that there's lots of people with those kind of passions around you, and that collectively will bring representatives and policymakers to have to deal with it.
Thank you. I would also add to that, as a manager, be a part of the process. So we are often reaching out to scientists to try to get information on the decisions that we face. I know that being a part of our working groups is not part of most scientists' jobs, and so not everyone can do it. So the more people that are willing to step up and step in and help inform those decisions, the better decisions that we can make.
On that, what Stephen was saying, and in communications training and everything, they tell us, know your audience. And particularly in my case, when I went to several environmental authorities in Colombia to say, okay, we need to go big, I, at the end, had to approach the individual ego, and I said, if we go big, you will be in the front of the newspaper. Seriously, and he said, okay, how big can we go? And I just said, 10,000, that's nothing. Okay, 20,000 in 1 year. We're doing it. And then he learned that I was trying to do the same in other parts of the world as well, increasing the magnitude. He said, well, Phanor, if you plant 20,000 here, and then you go across the globe and do another 20, I want 30,000. And if you go there and do 30, I want 40,000 here. Because it's his ego of being the manager that has done it. And I'm lucky that he's willing to take the risk, because as a manager, it's a huge risk. So you have to know your audience and, try some luck there.
Thank you.
Thank you. Great advice. Let's go to our next question. If you'd introduce yourself, please.
Hi, I'm Michele Collier with Everglades National Park. So we are in a part of the country and a part of the world where a lot of species are being imported for the pet trade, in particular, in the aquarium trade. So I wanted to maybe throw out there that possibly you are already testing moving species across ocean basins, and maybe ask you what you think about studying invasive corals, for instance, out, especially in the Florida Keys Reef Track.
Wow, okay, so I'm not aware that we've actually seen any invasive corals colonizing. So fortunately, I guess the coral trade and the aquarists are being responsible and not flushing their corals down the toilets. So I think that is a good thing, because if we are going to think about doing that down the road, way down the road, we have to be thoughtful, we have to test it, we have to do it very controlled. And so fortunately, we haven't had to deal with the fact that maybe that's already happening. We know from other examples that it can be extremely detrimental. So thankfully we're not experiencing it yet, and when we unwrap the plastic, down the road, and we have to bring that tool in, we want to do it thoughtfully.
Others want to weigh in on that one? Don't have to. Okay.
Thank you.
Yes, ma'am.
Hi, Sara Frias Torres with Vulcan. I said this yesterday in my talk. We are still accepting the breadcrumbs that come from the king's table. And we need our moonshot in coral reef restoration. For that, we need to work in our storytelling. We're not doing a really good job. I'm out there in Seattle, where some of the biggest fortunes in the United States concentrate, and it's hard to sell the concept of coral reef restoration. So help me in the storytelling. I have some ideas, talk to me. We have to build the storytelling. And the second part, let's follow what the NASA scientists and engineers did, because they sold out the concept of going to the moon. So selling the concept of rebuilding a coral reef should be much easier. Let's go for the moonshot and stop just accepting that the pie is so tiny, we have to take a tiny slice. So this is my time to invite everyone here, Coral Reef Restoration Consortium, the panel here of brilliant people. Let's go for it. Let's go for the moonshot. What should we do? Again, I'm all for it. Let's do it. Thank you.
So to the panel, do you have suggestions for storytelling?
I just echo what Sarah was saying about the importance of storytelling. Science is the language that some of us speak, but not most of us. Yet knowledge is a really, really important part of storytelling, and building the stories around knowledge is a really important thing that we can learn how to do. But it's also about your audience and their connection with what it is you're telling. And if we talk, my advice would be, if you want to talk about coral reefs, make them personal. Make people interested in what's there. There's amazing little critters that you can talk about, whether it's the corals or not, the gobies that do funny things, the cleaner fish, the amazing manta rays, and how they sweep across the reef. The manta rays that come in to, say, places where divers are set up at night with lights, and they're feeding in those lights, and sometimes those manta rays are trapped in fishing gear. But the people that go there all the time know when a manta ray comes through and is swimming in a certain way, that manta ray is trapped in fishing gear and will let you go up and release it. So these stories of people that are just interacting, not just with the reef as some idea, but the real organisms there are how you tell stories and get people involved. I wrote a book a couple of years ago with my son, who's a novelist, and the book is called The Extreme Life of the Sea, and we were working about how do we really encapsulate what this book is about, and it's about the way organisms live in extreme parts of the ocean. And Tony I'd written the introduction 3 times and had the editor reject it. It's like, no, write it again. And finally, Tony just said, look, nobody cares about the plot of anything until they care about the characters. And the characters of the ocean are the corals, but also the fish and the manta rays, and even the people there who are working in them. And that's how you tell a story. It's about the characters there. So that's just my advice about stories that connect with people about those things. Don't make it impersonal. Make it personal.
I just want to share two things. I totally echo what Steve's saying, and it's finding that personal connection. And I actually heard a story this morning. One of our amazing interns, Michele, told me that she decided to get into a career trying to help corals because she went snorkeling right off the beach in Miami one year and then saw the next year the devastation. And getting those personal stories, it touched me. Obviously, I'm already on the bandwagon, but if you tell those types of stories to people who are not in the community, that kind of passion will, it's infectious. Second thing I wanted to mention is that we are actually, the Coral Restoration Consortium, in the beginning phases of developing a comms strategy for exactly that purpose. We know we need to hit the decision makers, the policy makers, and the general public to get them just as jazzed about saving coral reefs as they are about saving the rainforest and saving the whales and all of that. So we're not the right people to do that. We're not in marketing. It's not our jobs. We need to get with that community to help us get the right message so that everybody understands that it's so important.
Sir.
My name's Ben Covan. I'm from Rich to Reefs, and I just had one question. If the purpose of all of this is restoring ecological functions to the reef, is there any evidence that microfragmentation and asexual reproduction produces sexually healthy corals that are able to spawn?
Yes.
Okay.
Where is Chris Page?
I'm sorry.
Chris, where are you? Talk to Chris Page.
Thank you.
Or anybody in the microfragmenting world, but he can point you toward them. We just talked about this at lunch for 45 minutes, and it's like, how big do they have to be, and how big can you cut them down, and then when do they become reproductive again? But absolutely, if they're very tiny fragments, they spend their energy mostly on growth, but after sort of getting back to a certain size, then they do see those pieces reproduce again. And Francesca's video earlier of the Cropper cervicornis was also small fragments that had eventually grown to become a spawning thicket, which is making cervicornis babies that will land on Curacao. I'm pretty excited about that one.
Thank you. Yes, sir.
I'm Dave Splitt. I'm with the Coral Restoration Foundation, at least on the board, so I don't really do any work. I know why it's difficult for the managers of reefs to answer certain questions or to even talk about them in a forum like this, but it ought to be easier. And I think I'll say, but what I really want to do is ask and not make a speech. I'm far up there, I can make speeches. But what I want to ask you about is the missing science. What's the science that's missing from this room, that's missing from that panel? It's political science. And what is the real role of political science in making all this come together? Why is it the missing leg of the stool?
I'll start. Thank you for raising that. Because as a manager, I can have the best science, I can have the best management plan, I can have the most solid strategy, and I cannot have public support. And because I am a public servant, we have to listen to what the community is asking for, and we can only achieve what there is support for. And so that is also why, and I encourage those folks who are wondering how can they help shape, be a voice. When we put out that restoration blueprint, which proposes to increase zones, restrict activities, we need somebody to say, yes, you must do that. Because I can assure you, I will hear plenty of, don't you dare do that. So we need the power of the people to say, we agree, we need to do more, we need to take these bold and big steps on behalf of our reefs, on behalf of the bigger marine ecosystem.
Just to add to that, we need to continue doing science research, because that gives us support, provides evidence that what we do definitely works. But also, and as I said before, involve the politicians in the decision making. They don't know the science that we do, definitely. And that's where Sarah's point is very important, that we need to learn to communicate that science to, as well, to others. And there is, as well as the CRC, the new working group, the managers working group. And I think that's one of the points that maybe we need to consider also getting involved in, is how, besides managers and practitioners, we start also involving the politicians so that they can work with us. But we also need to understand, I just finished, is that there is a higher risk in what we do. As I said, there is a high risk in failing. And unfortunately, a manager or a politician, because of votes, especially the politicians, sometimes they're not willing to take the risk because that will mean no vote for next election. So recommendation, and it all comes down to people, identify, know your audience, and find that person, that politician, that is willing to take the risk.
I just wanted to add to the comment about political science. I think it's also about social science. We need to really bring the social scientist into the room. I've been quite horrified, actually, as a scientist, to learn, and as a person who collects data and knowledge, on a day-to-day basis, that actually people don't use data and knowledge to make decisions, and having more knowledge doesn't necessarily change their behaviors. And so I think that the way forward has to be deeply embraced in communication, engagement, co-design, bringing everyone into the tent and making everyone part of the solution.
Yes, ma'am.
Hi, I'm Irene from the National Autonomous University of Mexico, and the question I'm going to do is kind of strange because during the week I've been thinking about it a lot. Like, there's no wall between one ecosystem and another. They are all interconnected. And I wanted to ask, like, all of you, maybe even people in the audience, from a basin system perspective, what do you think about the idea that we need to work in team with other ecosystem restoration strategies?
Colombia has a restoration plan, and they have prioritized the areas that need to be restored, and they move from sites or just one ecosystem to actually a mosaic of ecosystem. So they went to different locations, and I saw where there was a mangrove, seagrass, and coral reef. And if there was that connection there, the ranking of that site, improved. So it was prioritized as a highly needed of restoration. If that was the case, because of the mosaic, the connectivity that is between those ecosystems. So yes, it's, I think, already starting to be introduced into what we do, because we are not disconnected, and that extends to sandy bottom, mesophotic reefs, shallow reefs, lagoons, mangroves, marshlands, and all of that.
Yeah, we have an initiative in NOAA called our Habitat Focus Areas. It's exactly to do that. It's to focus the various restoration techniques and the interconnectedness of the ecosystems so that we are acting in one area to really try and see a difference. And similarly, though, like Sarah mentioned about the demonstration project or demonstration sites that we'd like to set up here and elsewhere, not only do we want to co-locate our restoration of the interconnected ecosystems, but we want to co-locate using a lot of those tools that we know how to use already at the same place. So outplanting your corals, outplanting your herbivores, manipulating other things to make sure that that site is getting the complement of tools and not just do a little bit here and do a little bit there and try this one there and try that one there. We need to also focus those things.
Good. Next.
Hi, everybody. My name is Scarlett Arana. I'm here because I'm a geospatial analyst, also a contractor for NOAA. But I took an initiative to actually start a nonprofit called Planets, and basically we're content creators for the nonprofits. I felt there was a need to create contents because there's a disconnect between scientists and production, and larger audience had a need. Today, this whole week, we've been broadcasting live with the United Nations to show everything that's been happening in this symposium, and it's been broadcast throughout the world. But as content creator and storyteller, one of the biggest questions everybody's been asking is, what is the call for action for Reef Futures for 2019? Thank you.
Yeah. As you heard Tom say, we're still trying to figure it out. We don't even know if there's going to be a Reef Futures 2019. I'm one of those people who might kill him. But okay, I'm gonna throw something out there. It's totally my opinion. It's just do it. We have to try all of these things and do them. Just my thoughts.
All right, we'll leave it at just do it. Thank you. Margaret.
Margaret Miller, I'm with Sea Corps International, and I have a loud mouth, so I'll step back a little bit. So as we see this consensus building that risky actions are going to be needed, are needed now, I guess I'd like to get you all's thoughts in terms of how we think about, I think the complement of that consensus is that our traditional precautionary approach to management is no longer safe or is no longer precautionary. We have a basic paradox there. And I'm just wondering, get you guys' thoughts about sort of how we evolve our concept of precautionary management, how we communicate that what has traditionally been precautionary is no longer safe, perhaps, if we want to maintain coral reefs. I'd just like to get your thoughts on that. Thank you.
I would totally agree with that. We saw a graph a couple days ago, the thermal anomalies going on in the world right now, and the graph basically in 10 years was larger, and in 20 years was larger, and 30 years was larger, and that represents the cost of doing nothing. And so one of my sort of offerings here would be to say the precautionary principle, which has guided conservation for decades, is a very good one, but is sort of predicated on the idea that doing nothing is okay. So in a world where doing nothing is increasingly risky, at some point the risk of doing nothing exceeds the risk of doing whatever it is you're talking about. And that's where I would begin to pull those together. So the precautionary principle at that point is not to do nothing, is to do the thing.
Can I add? Yes, so I think another thing that we can do when we communicate this is to let people know that we are concerned about this too, that these interventions, that doing nothing carries a risk, that interventions, these new interventions also carry a risk, that we are concerned about that, and that we care about that, and that is precisely why we work hard to make them less risky, to understand that. So I think not coming across as cowboys, not coming across as people who are willing to do anything, but actually share with people the concerns that we have, really goes a long way to make people realize that they are in safe hands, that we have the best intentions at heart, and that we're going to do our very best to achieve those.
This is a very real question for me. Because we, as I said in my remarks, we must act. And yet we don't know exactly what the formula is. We know there are many options, and so we're going to have to start by articulating specifics about what we want to achieve, because I don't think we've actually done that. We haven't really clearly articulated what is it we want to achieve, then examine the tools that we know are out there, which pieces of that can help us move in that direction, and then bloody hell, at one point we're just going to have to try. And then, as I said before, we're going to fail in part. We will. We will fail in part, but we will learn, and we will set up triggers that tell us, okay, at this if, then. If we see this, then we do a lot more of that. Or if we see that, whoa, let's reevaluate. It'll be an iterative process. It'll be a messy process. It'll be a hard process. But I don't see any choice, Margaret.
There's a metaphor that I use in different forms to try to grapple with the fact that as interventionists, we are hands-on, and there's a lot of hands-off and precautionary and threat mitigation-based conservation that's also super urgent. And yes, dinner conversation. One of the analogies I like to use is the idea that we have public health and we have exercise programs and nutritious meals in schools, and we get our steps and we have our Fitbits because none of us want to get cancer or diabetes or heart disease. And it's way more cost effective and better for society if we don't have any of those things. But if you have a heart attack or a diabetic episode and you get wheeled into an emergency room, you really want there to be a lot of tools and a lot of interventions that work really fast. So I consider ourselves, us as a community, sort of the like medical device interventionists. Like, okay, well, this is going really bad. We've got a few things that we can try, but obviously we would prefer if we didn't get to this situation.
All right, thank you all. Yes, ma'am. Hello, my name is Juliette, and I'm a French graduate student working in a Colombian NGO at the moment. And so during this week, we've been talking a lot about the disastrous effects of global warming on coral reefs. And my question is, how much do we know about how did coral reefs survive the previous global heating events that occurred on Earth? And can we learn lessons from that, possibly?
That's a great question. At one level, the answer is coral reefs will be fine, but it'll take a couple of million years. And that's the lesson of the fossil record, that they've gone through mass extinctions. The current sclerotinia corals have been through a couple of mass extinctions. The last one about 55 million years ago, and they recovered, but not for a very long time. And if we're really interested in how coral reefs as ecosystems support human communities, whether it's shoreline protection or fisheries or tourism or just the sheer wonderment and beauty of it, then we don't want to wait a million years for that to come back. And so the fossil record tells us that it will take a long, long, long time if we get to the point of a mass extinction. And that's, I think, what we're all trying to prevent. Let's not get there, because that will mean we'll never see it again in our lifetimes or our children's lifetimes.
Good afternoon. My name is Nora Galvis. I am the director of the Foundation ICRI Colombia. I have developed a career dedicated to the evaluation of conservation effectiveness on coral reefs. And at the beginning, when I studied at the University of Miami, all the efforts of science was on the water quality that finally haven't been managed yet. Like, we still have the problem all over in all the countries and all the coral reef areas. So we were talking about going to the moon. So how come we are still polluting the water? That sounds like uncivilized for me yet. And then yes, we have to go to convince top decision makers that we have to use the sewage water to produce renewable energy like Sweden is doing. So what we should start also talking about all this besides restoration, and also in the restoration, we have to find out ways to have resistant coral species to pollution, because we are just talking about thermal resistant species. We need to find also genotypes that are resistant to pollution, because the pollution is going on. There are outbreaks and diseases that we don't know, because all these boats come with contaminated with bacteria from other places and with polluted other areas. So I just wanted to think over on that we need to control all those other sources, but focus on that if the factors keep there, we can do a lot of restoration, and there are going to be outbreaks of diseases that will destroy everything. So we have to go upper to that level to try to change that also. The pollution should be stopped. Thank you.
I could offer a little anecdote about pollution and water quality from Curacao. There's not a lot of agriculture, so we don't worry a ton about nutrients so much. But there are overloaded sewage treatment plants that do not treat the sewage. And a student came over, just a bachelor student, to do some water quality studies and went around culturing for Vibrio naceae and worked with the medical lab on the island to do it. And he came up with these data, and they showed the government, and they go, wow, we've never found these before, but we've also never tested for them. Like, well, here you go. You're asking your tourist to swim and poop. And about 2 seconds later, there was 34 million guilders invested in sewage treatment modernization on the island. It was a bachelor student with some auger plates and some PCRs showing the brutal reality. And nobody had ever just made that connection and had that conversation and had that face-to-face confrontation. It just took one kid. So there's chances out there.
On that, two case studies. The first one, in San Andres, we have a sewage outflow. It's pretty much black water that just gets out there. And the corals around that area are doing really well. See? No, they like it dirty, I don't know, but they're doing really well. And I'm not the best person to describe this because I even haven't dived there, but you can ask Dr. Valeria Pizarro. She's from Colombia here as well. But if you haven't heard, Colombia has one of the heroic reefs in the world, Varadero Reef. It's been in the news, it's been everywhere. She discovered it, she's seen how in one of the most polluted bays of Latin America, of the Caribbean, you have, Valeria, 90% coral cover of orbicellas of 5 to 7 meters in diameter. So there is hope. Of course, we need to control pollution, yes, as well as we need to control CO2 and all of those impacts. That's the first step in reef restoration, right? But there is hope, and we just need to learn from those and protect and know that we have a cannery for reef restoration as well in the future.
Anyone else want to speak to that one? All right. I know I've been going back and forth, but you guys have been waiting longer. You're next, sir.
Thank you. So I think we all know corals are kind of sexy right now. So we've had Chasing Coral, recently. Aquaman's just coming out. We got an X Prize featuring coral reefs. So, and I'm not sure if you guys have heard, but viral sensation Chad Goes Deep has been convincing people to bleach their hair in solidarity with coral. And this is just a surfer bro that's getting people on board with coral bleaching. So my question is, how do we leverage this current public attention into actually, taking action right now as experts?
Prize challenge.
The X Prizes compete with each other to be bigger. Yeah. So we're gonna get 30 different X Prizes, and they can compete with each other to see who does the most X Prize-y X Prize. I don't have any answer to that, but I will say that the awareness and the sort of general understanding of the state of corals is completely different than it was 10 or 15 years ago. And as much as we wring our hands over messaging and communication, there's massive progress that's been made.
Local actions for global results, I think it goes that way. So all that momentum, we can, at the smaller scale of raising coral in Costa Rica, Oceanos in Mexico, you know, those small projects that are starting small as in the region where they're working, you know, we need to capitalize on that. We keep creating the momentum and giving impetus to coral reef restoration and conservation. So thank you very much, because we are capitalizing on that. So keep doing it, because we will take advantage of that.
What I will do, I think, is propose the National Academy Committee that we all bleach our hair in solidarity. But what you've hit is an aspect of communications that is different than television and the press. It is using the power and enthusiasm of social media to get ideas across and allow people to connect with them through some action. And you know, those of us in the room here, think about those things. What can you do? What can you get excited about? What makes you feel good about doing these things? The creator of SpongeBob SquarePants recently passed away. That, although it was such a strange set of characters, was an entry into the kind of world that marine biologists used to just call their very own. These kinds of things can happen, and they can capture people's imagination. Going back to Sarah's question about storytelling, you know, don't just dismiss the bleached hair thing as just being some weird thing. It could work. It could make a difference. I'll tell the committee.
Yes,
Won't
ma'am.
matter to me.
Sure.
Hi, my name is Kelsey. I'm a graduate student at the Rosenstiel School at the University of Miami, and my question is actually a little similar. I believe there's an untapped resource in the private sector, like tech industries like Facebook and Amazon, these companies that are looking to contribute to efforts that benefit humanity, or even in the art community, which is also super influential. But how do we continue encouraging this cross-pollination of industries and seize this market to help spread our message and support our research? I think in my experience, I often find myself in an echo chamber, and I want to know how we can break out of our bubble.
Again, go back to Colombia. The payment for ecosystem services pilot that we have is thanks to a compensation program. The corporations have to, by a law in Colombia, now have to compensate the carbon footprint. And so that they buy carbon credits, so unfortunately they can continue polluting, but then they use that money to compensate and incentivize conservation. It has worked really, really well for protecting and conserving forests. There's about 6,000 families, not individuals, families, that thanks to these corporations compensating for CO2 emissions, that now they have an alternative livelihood, okay? And now we're piloting that for ocean conservation as well in Colombia. Our program is the first one, 28 fishermen. And that is as good for funding projects, which we don't have for next year, but anyway, but also for branding. And I think in one of the sessions we're talking about, you know, brand marketing as well and brand greening. This is an alternative too. So my answer is we need to start looking at numbers, economy, and look at the blue economy, because that's where I think funding conservation is going to come from.
Thank you. All right, we're going to take these last three, and then we'll have to wrap it up. Yes, ma'am.
Okay, I'm getting back to communication. My name's Joni Clapas from the National Center for Atmospheric Research and Raising Coral Costa Rica. Thanks for the plug, Phanor. One of the things I think a lot of us are struggling with is the messaging. So this is very sexy. People will grab onto it. It's going to have a lifetime. And there's also an issue, that a lot of complaints that I think are very valid, that this distracts from some of the bigger problems or from our existing efforts to protect coral reefs. So the existing problem being, how do we, how much should we be putting our efforts into stopping the cause, which is climate change, versus working on the reefs. But I mean, we all want to do restoration. We all want to see this as the way forward, but there's a danger to pushing it too hard without keeping people aware of reducing the cause. So I just want to know your thoughts on how do we get this message straight, and how can we all speak with one voice with this message, because we know the media will probably run out of here and they'll have 10 different messages if we don't give it to them. So I was just curious of your thoughts of how we should do that.
I think about that question a lot because here in the Florida Keys, the economy is dependent upon our marine ecosystem, period. And so, and our community recently went through a major hurricane that really hit the economy and the tourism industry in particular very, very hard. The coral disease event that is affecting our corals is creating a lot of fear in the tourism industry. Those of you that heard about the red tide events this year in Florida that really hurt the tourism industry in other parts of our state, thankfully we did not experience that down here, but that is an example of an environmental event and the messaging that can really have an impact to the economy. And so we struggle to try to find that balance in message that is urgency, but yet hope, because I believe if people are just fearful, they're paralyzed, they're just not going to be motivated to do anything. And so to me, it's about finding that balance. It's about providing truth, but also possibility. And so this is very, very real for me. And the other thing is that I will tell you that people from Iowa, like my family, come down here and they look at these reefs. I've heard it noted before in this conference, and they think they're beautiful. They think they're fabulous. And so, and there are places here that show hope. And it's more than just a reef ecosystem here. There's a whole lot of amazing, diverse life here. And that's why I was saying on the first day, if you heard me, that this is a very complex place. So the story is very difficult to just put into a soundbite that truly carries the appropriate message. So I don't have an answer for you, but I promise you it's something I struggle with literally every single day, trying to figure that out. So I'm interested to hear if some of the other panelists can inform.
Well, no, I can't do that. I mean, sadly, other than I said, we are working on a strategy. We know we need to develop those messages so that we are all speaking of one voice. But to the point about detracting potentially from other things that we need to be doing, the analogy I always try to use is that it's like restoration is like one of the tires on a car, and addressing climate change is another tire, and land-based source of pollution is another tire, and overfishing is another tire, right? And so imagine right now, they're almost all flat. If we are able somehow miraculously to put air in all the threat-based tires, and we don't do restoration along the way, there will be no corals once we fix those tires. So we have to do it all at the same time, or else we won't be able to drive our car at the end of this.
Thank you, Jennifer. That was a good analogy. I think it's actually good that after all the discussions of reef restoration, we come down to the same conclusions. We need to curb CO2. Dr. Ruth Gates says at the end, the way to do it is control CO2 and control how many babies you have. With just too many producing too much CO2. So my analogy will be to that, which is good. So if there is a life-threatening situation, if you are in an accident where your life is at danger, the first thing that we do, call the ambulance, and we start doing CPR, pumping, until we take them to the hospital. But in the meantime, we're calling, keep everything ready there so that when we get there, we have a chance to bring these people back to life. It's the same analogy, I think. I mean, we're not saying, we're just going to go do PCR and see what happens. No, it's let's prepare the road and keep doing PCR to see when we reach the end, we have a chance or a higher chance of survival.
Dana.
Hi, I'm Dana Wasenick-Mendez with NOAA's Coral Reef Conservation Program. We're all, I think, painfully and very frustratingly aware that resources to support coral reef conservation have been very limited. And we've all been unable to access the resources we know we need to get the job done. And I think we're also all in agreement that both intervention and threat abatement and local and global levels are really essential pieces of that conservation puzzle, and we need to do both if we have a chance. And I guess my question is how do we integrate? How do we avoid competing against each other? We're all in the same family here. How do we kind of inflate all the tires that Jen refers to? And similar to, that story we heard on the first day of those two X-Prize teams that were competing against each other, but then they realized in order to succeed they needed to join forces. How do we do that? How do we join forces to make sure that we don't lose these amazing ecosystems that we all care about so much?
I don't know necessarily how we do it. One model that Tom mentioned in the one of his opening remarks is the Stand Up to Cancer model. It's incentivizing collaboration. I think that's something that we really need to think about doing. I mentioned that actually 2 years ago when we had the first workshop. That's how you really get people to work together, is you incentivize it. They get extra money by working together. And I don't have the purse strings. I don't have I can't actually do that. But I think that's what we need to happen, is to incentivize collaboration so that people don't go back to their own labs and wait to publish their thing and not share it because that's how they, the community is set up, right? We can't do that. We have to break down those walls and you have to incentivize collaboration.
There's a few different questions that are hitting on the same idea that there's a tension between conservation and intervention and hands-on action, and I don't feel like they are as at odds as maybe some people in the room, but I did have a conversation at dinner last night about how there's the budget of this NGO and it's either going to go to hands-on stuff and at the cost of the sort of sanctuaries and protections, but the pie's not going to get bigger. So what I would like to say is if you're a funder, add a 0 to your budget, to your program, and then add another 0. Do it. There are a lot of people in this room who work for free part of the year, including this woman right here, including my favorite people in the world. There are a lot of people in here who are sacrificing their financial stability and their retirement hopes to do this work. And I don't know that the funders necessarily understand how much better we would do and more productive we would be if we were funded like we were cancer doctors and not funded like we were, hippies in the woods.
I also say that we keep fighting for a slice of the cake instead of baking our own cake. And I mean about funding. We all, yeah. No, but what I'm saying is that it's a multidisciplinary approach to reef restoration that we have here. You have the scientists, you have the hands-on practitioners, you have the managers, you have, I like to put names, you have Coral Vita with the model, that business model to it. So I think we already get in there to actually bake our own cake, and you have some philanthropists here or people who is in charge of raising funds. Well, get them on board, I think, or they already know, And I asked that person, Is it difficult nowadays to raise money for this? I say, no. It's just that we don't know how to do it. We're talking about communications and we don't know how to do it, but we don't know how to fundraise either. So let's find people that know how to do it, and they will help us do our job.
All right, last question.
Hello, my name is Noelle. I'm with the University of Alberta. And this week there's been a lot of talk about engaging diverse stakeholder groups in decision making. And we've seen some really, really inspiring socioeconomic community engagement models, which has been really cool. However, there still seems to be kind of a disproportionate representation of many of these groups who are often the most immediately dependent on some of these marine resources. What do you all see as some guiding principles to better empower the local communities that many of these projects are occurring in to truly have restoration science be more inclusive in the decision-making process?
That's a great question and an elephant in the room. I think Lisa Karn had to leave because she had a family emergency with her dog, but she did a great example of showing us how you get it done and integrate with the community. And I think that part of the reason is she didn't wait for more diverse groups to trickle up the academic pipeline. 25 years from now, it'll be a more diverse group of PhDs. She went out and made it happen.
I would say that certainly as scientists, we very much need to come out of our ivory towers and get down on the ground and actually talk to people about what they want, how they want their reefs in the future, and listen to them to design, co-design and go forward with them rather than trying to tell them what they should or should not want. So I think it's about communicating, engaging, and being willing to listen to what is being said.
In Africa, there is the concept of locally marine managed areas, where people get together. You know, they traditionally fish in this area, and the managers or the government says, we know that we cannot do it. We don't have the resources to manage. Why don't you organize? We give you rights to that area, and you manage. Traditionally, it's your area. Why don't we start talking about maybe locally restore managed areas? And we are piloting, and if you went to Mariana Heneco's talk about the proposal that she has about how to make conservation participatory and restoration, in Colombia, and it's about involving every single relevant social actor into the process. It takes a lot of time, it takes a lot of effort. We're still seeing how we're going to fund all the workshops and all the things that we need to do to achieve that, but we're going to try to do it. We just do it and see how it is, but trying to involve every single person from every single background, because they will have a say, and definitely that builds ownership, and it will help us set up the environment to increase the success of our actions.
All right, a good note to end on. Please join me in thanking all of our panelists.